everybody. I'm Dana Fisher. I'm a sociologist and a sociology professor at the University of Maryland. I run the program for society and the environment there. I'm also a contributing author to Working Group 3 in Chapter 13. Yay, Chapter 13, which is, I was specifically tasked with coming in to add a new section looking specifically at civic engagement and the role of activism. And what's, I think, really interesting here is there's so much discussion right now about these bottom-up efforts to pressure policymakers at the local level, at the state level, at the national level, at the international level. I've actually been studying the role of civil society at these multi-levels since the 1990s through the Kyoto process. And one of the things that the IPCC asked me to do, which I found really challenging, was to measure the carbon impact of activism and engagement, which is something, yeah, I know. And I was like, as a social scientist, we think about this from, as a social scientist, we think about it completely differently than when I'm in the climate world and talking the climate world. And everybody's like, oh, it's great, go pressure, go lobby, go bird dog. But what does it actually mean for climate? And so basically, I wrote this really long thing that ended up in Wire's Climate Change. And they made me cut most of it because it didn't actually have any relationship whatsoever to actual climate, in terms of carbon or any greenhouse gas, right? So I then went looking for all this, for the research that exists that helps us to think through what does it actually mean for carbon if you write a letter to an elected official or you participate in a protest. And so that's something that's, driving a lot of my work right now. I'm actually starting a new project looking at the emergent civilian climate corps, where we actually are hopefully I'm going to work with folks as this program gets kicks off to actually measure what are the effects in terms of, there it is, in terms of work in a corps to address climate change, right? If we put up 3 solar panels, what does it mean? If people plant trees, what does it mean? So those are the kinds of questions that I've been struggling with for the past few years.
Wow. But I guess it's encouraging to know that that's getting into the IPCC mix. It's also, to me, the reason I went, wow, is because I know that, as I've said this before, and it reminds me of a line from that book, The Little Prince, that which is most essential is invisible. This was the fox talking to the kid and the guy in the desert. And that for sustainability, that which is potentially most important seems really hard to measure. So that seems like a grand
we
challenge.
Don't think about it at all. It's not in the models as you guys know better than me. But it's something that we have to measure, particularly when there are these global calls for activism. There's going to be another climate strike, another Fridays for Future global strike on September 24th. But what does it actually mean? And, there's all these claims about the effectiveness of protest and activism, but we need to think about, just because you're successful in getting, somebody who you expect to be a climate champion elected doesn't actually mean that it has any effect, on climate change.
I've got to ask you, is this something that activists fear? Do they not want to hear the results?
Ooh, Paul's nodding. That's a good question. So far, I actually don't. I think that mostly I've gotten pushback on the ways that I'm understanding these coalitions of activists that are involved, rather than there being pushback about not wanting to be measured in this way. So far, I haven't heard that. I honestly am not sure that this conversation and this question has really gotten out into the general public yet. I think everybody just thinks you get a lot of people in the street yelling, maybe put a pink hat on them and it'll make a difference, right?
So Ed, you obviously had a burning question.
Yeah, Dana, it's nice to meet you. And this is fascinating. And it's relevant to me, not just as an IPCC author, but actually the academic unit I run. We have everything from folks who take a very activist stance on stuff to folks who take very institutionalist stances on how to bring about. Everyone's interested in change, right? But they're coming from that whole range. And one of my big arguments to everybody is there isn't a right approach, right? That you got to line up all of these things. So one of the things I'm interested in just hearing from you is there's so many variables you must be trying to control for, right? You could have a brilliantly conceived protest movement, but they're aimed at the wrong institutional thing. And pulling that lever doesn't actually do anything. And so, like, how do you control for all of that? Because that strikes me as almost boggling.
Oh, yeah. Well, you try your best, right? I mean, so, I wear two hats. I do work in the climate world. I do work in the social movements world and the kind of political world. So I think about this from two different sides. I mean, there's no question that thinking through targets and tactics and timetables and organizational forms of activism, be they, local community groups or professionalized national, like 350 type organizations, matters a lot. And then there's also the way it actually plays out. I mean, if you organize a huge protest and a bunch, and all these activists come in nasty diesel buses to Washington, D.C., and then, as tends to get on in the media, leave a whole bunch of trash behind, which always, that's the most common thing to talk about after the protest. What does that mean for climate change? Does it weigh out? I mean, so basically, I'm starting from almost zero, not quite zero. There's been some really descriptive work that looks at the relationship between protests and bills, as well as pushback. Leah Stokes has some really interesting work on pushback, and basically the counter effects of activism in some ways, where you end up with conservative efforts that that then stop climate progress because of activism. So they're both sides of this. So the answer is, I don't know yet, but what I'm hoping to do is, I have a small bit of funding from the USDA, and we actually have a call later today to start to try to bring together what I'm hoping will be a dream team of folks who can help me start to think about how we're going to measure all of these variables. So, but it's a huge lift, right? And but we need to do this work. I think it's just as important as modeling the fossil fuel transition.
Dana, it's a pleasure to meet you, and I love what you're trying to do. I'm curious about whether what is it that you're trying to measure? The effect of the protests on policy, or is it the effect of the protests on the protesters and their maybe on their opponents? Because one of the big questions that people always have about this area is, what does it mean for me as an individual? And I think there's a kind of dangerous place there where the whole issue can be pushed onto individual behavior, when really the most important aspects of it are all about infrastructure and big systems that have to be changed at the system scale and not at the individual scale. But there is still a role for individuals. But anyway, I'd be curious to hear how you're thinking about that.
Well, so as I talk about in the piece that Andy just had up, I talk about the ways that when we think about social movements, but I think more broadly civic engagement, and social movements is just one way that citizens engage, right? But when we think about that, there are many different ways of having an effect, right? And some of them are direct effects, right? And I review the literature on lifestyle change, going vegan. I talk about the fact that is only a very small part of being able to think about a transition that will be effective to meet the needs that are required to address the issue. And then I also talk about these more indirect effects, right, in terms of pushing for institutional political change, which is clearly absolutely what's needed, and one of the main things that I've been studying for the past 20 plus years. In other work that I do, I look at there's more specific questions about, I change the dependent variable, and I ask about what are the effects on individual people in terms of engaging in politics, engaging in climate work, one of my recent books was on environmental stewardship, specifically studying tree planting initiatives, focusing on the Million Trees Initiative in New York, and finding the ways that planting trees actually played a huge role in people creating narratives for themselves about being more environmentally interested, as well as it actually got them more involved in democracy in a bunch of ways. But in this work that I've been doing for IPCC, not to sound crass, but they don't care about that part. They only care about the climate aspect, right? And if we're thinking about the climate aspect, as you say, rightfully, this is all about institutional large-scale change that's needed for us to get to meet the demands or meet the crisis head on. And if you're talking about that, then we really need to be thinking about what is the effect of the more indirect levers that citizens use to affect change around climate, which is going through economic sector in some ways by pushing for, divestment, for example. There's very little that's been written about the carbon effects of the divestment movement, but it needs to be done. And then at the same time, also the indirect channels that are used to change what's going on in politics in terms of, what can activists do that will have an effect on, infrastructure, and not only infrastructure in terms of a policy in place, but the implementation of it that then yields actual carbon reductions. So it's maybe something I'm going to do for the next 20 years, maybe more. I don't know. Hopefully there'll be lots of other people who want to join me on this quest, because it's a huge task.
Here's Kami Sethi from Harlem. Working in a nearby community in Harlem, I'm constantly wondering how to educate local communities. Protests only achieve so much.
What I would just say is that one of the things, so my recent book, which came out in 2019, is called American Resistance. And it was actually a pause from the work I was doing on elite policymaking around climate change when there was very little happening here in the United States, and a focus more on what was happening in the streets, because as you know, this huge resistance emerged and large-scale protests became commonplace here in the United States. And one of the things I learned from that research was that the way that we think about activism and protests historically is really different from the way it works today. The way it works today is that people come out and get involved in protests, which tends to be digitally coordinated, tends to be the first step for many people in putting themselves on a pathway towards engagement and towards activism. And basically, I tracked all these people who got involved in the resistance, starting at the Women's March, but going all the way through People's Climate March that took place in 2017, and even more recently looking at the post-George Floyd Black Lives Matter protests. And one of the most notable things was that when you ask people what the top issues are that they're concerned about today, in the top 3 is climate change. And this is across, it doesn't matter what protest people are participating in on the left, it's climate change. And the number 2 thing that I think is really valuable here is when I ask people about the types of engagement they're involved in, they basically talk about channeling their concern into electoral politics. And electoral politics is a really important lever that citizens can use and don't use nearly enough to make social change of all sorts. But if you think about this, not just in terms of voting for a president, but voting for, community boards and elected officials at the city level, all the way up the ballot until you hit the president, that is where social change really can happen. And when you think about the climate, that is where we can see people having an effect. That's one of the reasons that Sunrise, which is probably the largest group that's coordinating young people, or at least the most notable one in the United States, is starting to field their own candidates, because they feel like it's better to field candidates who are pro-climate in the way that they think is important, rather than trying to find people and shifting their opinions once they're elected.
There's a lot there. And I think way back in 2006, I wrote an article called Yelling Fire on a Hot Planet. That was when Al Gore's movie had come out, and the right wing and fossil fuel interests got really active in challenging the whole narrative. One thing that had come out at that time, 2006, Dan Abbasi, who was then at Yale at the forestry school, wrote this book, Americans and Climate Change. And what he was proposing at a meeting to a bunch of environmental groups was to bring the adaptation side into the activism, to make vulnerability reduction part of the narrative for activism, because then that can lead to more buy-in. These communities, we just did a session here last week with Catherine Sutherland, who studies Durban's informal settlements, which are all in floodplains or on steep slopes. And that community doesn't really give a hoot about climate policy. They give a hoot about vulnerability reduction. So you don't want to cut them out of the loop either.
Well, that's one of the reasons that a lot of activists have shifted towards including frontline communities, as well as communities of color, and questions of environmental justice, as well as racial justice and equity broadly defined into their goals. and it has been a really effective coordination tool for expanding the coalition in really meaningful ways, I think.